Hello everyone, today we talk about an example of medieval curriculum. University-wise, we made different videos, mostly revolving obviously around the most important universities. We never really made anything more in-depth about one or the other. I also have a series on medieval law. I haven't created a playlist for it, but we discussed a bit like the history of juridical science in the Middle Ages, passing unavoidably through universities that were primarily born out of that. Right, we'll see this better now because essentially to provide a clear example of how teaching worked in the Middle Ages, this video will focus on the law schools of Bologna. That, as you know, is also the oldest continuously operating university in the Western world, whose formal teaching of Roman law is traditionally dated to around 1088. Traditionally, because it may have been even older, as a matter of fact, but later tradition wanted to establish a year in particular. There is all a specific context for this. Obviously, Bologna quickly became the principal center for legal studies across Europe. And in our series about the Italian communes, but also history of the church, we talk about the Decretum Graziani, canon law, etc. And from there, like a lot of other subjects that tie well in with the civilizational development, right? State building, fundamentally. These were the most fiercely aggressive, advanced communities in the Middle Ages. And the fact that law was at the center of university development obviously should not come as a surprise, because without regulation, there can't be fundamentally even an orderly state. And in general, right, the idea that legal science was incredibly important, just like the medical one, for example, something that survived throughout the entire Ancien regime. And just think that doctors of law were at some point knighted, right? Their services were so important to the community that the status could be enormous. Like, everybody employed this man, and we'll talk more about this surely in some video about administration, institutions, because every kingdom, every policy in Europe made use of such lawyers in order to stabilize their own domains, to render more secure justice, more effective, and so on. But there is properly a university dimension that we have already often discussed in terms of think that these people had to learn not just the entire Roman law as it was being recovered in the West, while in the East nobody cared about it anymore. That's, speaking volumes. I often say about this, the level of Western civilizational advancement compared to the East already at this point. But all the comments, right, all the gloxes, as they were called, how the various juridical theorists that had in fact taught them, and whose comments on Roman law, and for the sake of the application in the concrete case of the present and a very complex society, in fact, over the time, that were enormous, were much bigger than saying Roman, all by heart, right? There were some people that even learned the entire Bible by heart in the Middle Ages, but here, as a doctor in law, you had to literally do it for the entirety of Roman law and great part of these other texts as they were piling up. This tells you how and why, naturally, this was such an incredible center of learning. At some point, we shall talk about the Sorbonne, and so therefore the theological center of Europe, Paris, etc. For today, we look at this curriculum, right? Now, these institutions, by the way, were selected both because they were the oldest universities and because they served as the model adopted by schools in other disciplines, including the study of medicine as well. In fact, in many ways, this study is originally entwined, right, for different practical reasons. Now, the revival of systematic legal education at Bologna is credited, as you know, to Irenaeus, roughly mid-11th to after the century to after 1125. known as the Lucerna Iuris, or Lamp of the Law, who began lecturing on the newly rediscovered texts of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis in the late 11th century, transforming scattered earlier efforts into a structured scholarly enterprise that attracted students from across Europe as well. The international character of Bologna is also notorious if you have ever studied the history of the university. We will not here talk necessarily much about all the philological issue of how we can document, properly reconstruct the recovery of Roman law at this point. In Italy, from there throughout the rest of the Middle Ages to virtually like the rest of Europe, at least of Western Europe, and this is yet, in fact, a topic that I mostly dealt with in separated videos, each dedicated also to the various European countries. Now, unlike modern institutions, a medieval university had no single dedicated building, at least originally. Classrooms operated in the earlier period as scattered rental spaces across the urban fabric of the city center, reflecting the student-driven guild structure, the Universitas Scholarium, that characterized Bologna from its earliest days. Essentially, it was the students who started, say, people in general, they started paying the masters of law that had mostly been educated prior to the communal institution, and that was separated in any case from the university one, in the capitular chapters of the local diocese, of the bishop counts of the great cities of northern Italy. And Bologna had been basically the same. So these people began to pay these guys who worked for the bishops, and at some point they started working as free professionals, aside also from their more regular employment, up to developing the university that was eventually a standalone enterprise, so to say, on its own. But it was the students and the masters together that initially founded the entire institution. Each professor was responsible for renting his own space. He had to ensure that the chosen rooms were not located too close to particularly noisy areas, such as the workshops of blacksmiths or the elementary scolette, where children reading aloud created an infernal racket. This decentralized guild-based organization stemmed from the university's origins as a corporation of foreign students seeking protection and collective bargaining power against local authorities and landlords in the growing commercial city of Bologna. So quite thickly packed space. Medieval towns were definitely much more stuffed and overcrowded than the ancient ones, as a matter of fact. And consider that in northern Italy at this point, there were as many people living in the city as in the relative district in the countryside. So it's something completely different from antiquity, where just a staunch minority of the local district actually lived in the city. So environmental concerns, but also political ones, as we've seen here, the necessity to affirm the guild as actually a political actor as well. The university was one. Admittedly, they would never actually gain, the one of Bologna and others obviously would be very important, very powerful, but they weren't much like the guilds we find otherwise in the institutional systems, etc. Here, we could actually say that it was a bit the case. There were at some point other universities born in other cities out of the secessions that stem from the Bolognese one. Now, despite the initial lack of permanent facilities, the problem of the classroom received considerable attention at the time. A vivid illustration of this concern comes from Boncompagno da Signa, who was an Italian scholar and professor of rhetoric born in Signa near Florence between 1165 and 1175, who taught at Bologna and later Padua. In fact, was born, as we were saying, actually out of a secession from Bologna, and was known for his innovative treatises on persuasive composition. In his Rhetorica Novissima, a work completed in 1235, Boncompagno describes what an ideal classroom for effective teaching should look like, and the passage is striking for its surprising modernity. It says, "The classroom should be built in a free and healthy space, far from the coming and going of women, from the noise of the square, from the clatter of horses, from traffic, from the barking of dogs, from annoying noises, from the crash of cards, and from every stench. It should have equal width and length. It should be clean of dust and every dirt. There should be no pictures or paintings in it, except perhaps of that type which through imagination, that is, through imaginary forms and through notable figures, may give help to the memory for the disciplines in which the minds are engaged. But rather let all the walls be adorned with green in color and in light. There should be a single entrance, and the stairs should not make access difficult. There should be 2 or 3 windows arranged in such a way that the professor may occasionally, and especially in fine weather, catch a glimpse of the surrounding areas, the trees, the vegetable gardens, and the orchard, since it is in the sight of pleasant things that the memory is strengthened. Boncompagno's emphasis on environmental factors for memory and focus reflected broader scholastic interests in psychology and the art of memory, while his career also included works on dictamen, so the art of letter writing that influenced notarial and diplomatic practices across the Italian communes. Right, I made a video about the ars dictaminis as well, if you're interested. So you understand how these people were naturally very developed all around. From an intellective standpoint, they were polymaths in many ways, and people of really considerable social, cultural status. Inside such a classroom stood a cathedra equipped with a lectern for the book. In the earliest period, when books were still extremely rare and expensive, the cathedra was placed in the center of the room so that students could also read from the same volume, right, as the master. Later, once the system of the pece, that is slim fascicles which together compose the book, had been introduced around 1200 in Bologna as an innovative rental method for mass-producing accurate manuscript copies of textbooks through stationers who hired out number quires sequentially to copists, the cathedra was moved against one wall and raised higher, with the students seated in front of the master. The pece system is very interesting. It originated, as I just said, in Bologna before spreading to places like Paris. At that point, because you see, we are at the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, the Dominican networks, that, as you know, will sort of take over a great part of university teaching, allowing controlled, accurate reproduction of texts by dividing approved exemplars into rentable sections, typically 4 to 8 folios each, with university statutes regulating stationers to prevent errors or price gouging and enabling simultaneous copying by multiple scribes. Right, so basically, we went there to these shops, and that were controlled by the university at some point. Initially, things would have been a bit more simple, right? But the point was that the university conferred these sheets that altogether were essentially the lessons, and it took naturally a long time. Imagine the work of these people, to put together and because the same. And paper had arrived by this point, but a lot of this had been in parchment. And so the point was that the university had to ensure that these folios were, this reproductions were accurate, right? So that students could copy the same exact text. This was a concern, obviously, at the time, if you know also how manuscripts were generally copied at the time. And they could thus all reliably get their manuscripts that otherwise would have been too costly to simply buy, already made and for students. And so they could have simply copied them further, in ways that naturally would have also not been fully controllable, but still allowing for an easier access to the source. Now, at first, many rooms had no benches whatsoever, and students sat on the floor on heaps of straw. Right, over time, benches were introduced for them, sometimes with an optional lectern. Using these required payment of an annual fee, and those who occupied the front rows had to pay a supplementary charge. The academic year began in October, initially on the 8th, later on the 18th. We were talking, again, specifically Bologna, because we know the actual details from this. This was the feast day of Saint Luke the Evangelist, Lessons concluded at different dates depending on the discipline, between August the 15th and September the 7th. In compensation, the calendar included many feast days and long breaks at Christmas, Easter, and during Carnival. This schedule, governed by student-controlled statutes, aligned with the liturgical calendar of the church while accommodating the practical needs of a mobile student population drawn to Bologna for intensive legal training amid the city's commercial vibrancy. Daily teaching followed the traditional canonical hours. These hours divided the day according to the monastic pattern of prayer times established centuries earlier, with prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at midday, and noon in the mid-afternoon. Classes started shortly after dawn and ran from prime to terce and from terce to sext, so roughly from 6 to 12. They resumed at noon and continued into the late afternoon. On average, a lesson lasted 3 hours. Thus, though this was later reduced to 2 in the 15th century and to 1 hour a century later, people were becoming dumber. That's yet another proof that modernity does that. And I'm not joking, by the way. Comprehensive sort of history of literature, law, science, like education. But we'll talk about this in another video. The adoption of monastic canonical hours for academic scheduling underscored the close intertwining of ecclesiastical and scholarly life in medieval Bologna, where many students and masters held clerical benefices initially, as we were discussing. I can't stress enough, again, how entwined these legal studies were with the local capitulary chapters. Right, these professors were essentially working in the entourage of the bishop as administrators for running the city, right, in the district. There is all a prehistory to this. I made a video about urban power before the communes that sort of addresses not specifically this thing of universities, but gives you an idea of who counted in the city and also why these people were so literate in particular. Now, the structure of the curriculum that we're discussing today fundamentally was clearly divided, of course. In the morning, the so-called ordinary lessons were held, which covered the fundamental parts of each discipline. For civil law, these were the code, right, the codex, obviously. They were talking about the Corpus Juris Civilis, the first 9 books, and the Old Digest, books 1 to 24.2, while for canon law, the focus was on the Decree of Gratian, the Decretum Gratiani, that, as you know, is the most important, in fact, collection of canon law that eventually became sort of the standard, right? There were many before, so there were all these traditions historically from quite a while, starting probably from all the canons collected for all the ecumenic councils and also the local ones. In fact, the Decretum Gratiani is also known as the Concordia Discordantium Canon, so the harmonization, so the concord of the discording canons. And that was in parallel, in fact, to the recovery of civil law for lay, for properly, like, in fact, civil law of the lay institutions. The parallel that this point was developing in the church. And again, I can't stress it again enough. This church and state were not separated here in space. They were, as you know, people don't know it, actually think the church and state are separated like 100 years ago. No, church and state were always separated, but I mean, they were here, studied, known, and by the same people, that these canon law and civil law interacted constantly. We are at the time of the investiture controversy, so it couldn't be otherwise, because both sides had much at stake on sort of defining the limits of the sort of imperial and the papal law and so on. So in any case, they were harmonized. They were obviously always coexisting. Never think the Middle Ages was papacy versus empire, as if they were something alien to one another. They were normally backing one another, and formally this was recognized. Now, the code and the digest, we're using sort of just the English names, formed core sections of the Corpus Juris Civilis. So as we were saying before, the monumental 6th century compilation of Roman law ordered by Emperor Justinian, and actually based as this was actually a fulfillment of the Theodosian code, if we want really to be proper, all right? But Justinian did things in grand style, sort of harmonized everything, and added also very important elements to it, especially of jurisprudence. This was quote unquote rediscovered in the 11th century, or at least by this time, and that's why universities are born, revolve around the recovery of Roman law, and however, on the basis of the previous juridical science that existed at this point, imperial legislation, Frankish Lombard law, local customs, feudal law, and so on. However, when we talk about Roman law, it was not recovered because they thought it was, as it would become later, essentially a new common law for Europe, but essentially just a complement, like the point of reference to be used for practical application. It was always the Bolognese bias. So like in continental Europe, this was the spirit of legal studies, to be concretely applied to local reality, not a random reconstruction of Roman law for no reason, but just to fill the gaps of the juridical systems of the time. They were not unified, were not born, at least initially, but as a sum of different laws from, say, we've seen the customary ones, the one of the Germanic peoples, the feudal law, and so on. And however, Ignatius and his successors at Bologna used the Corpus Juris Civilis as gradually was being rediscovered as the foundation for systematic legal education. Again, let's not talk about how this had been quote-unquote recovered, right? Because the idea is that the code had been issued at the time of Justinian after Italy had been reconquered. However, we realize that this happened, as you know, through the Pragmatica Sanctio. Pragmatica Sanctio that was issued for Italy in particular, interestingly enough. However, we know philologically and literally, and just looking at how Italian law worked in the following years, that this was barely circulating, right? Even in the Byzantine part of Italy, we kind of lose track of this. And so obviously most of Italy used Lombard law. That was actually very effective, and in fact Roman law is recovered on the basis of Lombardistics. It was actually very advanced by this point. Again, all these professors that found universities were primarily Lombardists. They specialized in Lombard law that had remained the local national body of law on which the Frankish capitularies, then again imperial constitution, etc., had been grafted, feudal law, and so on. We realized that even in the Byzantine Empire, in Byzantine Italy, the Sanctio circulated the corpus so much, right? This is interesting because it shows also how it had obviously fallen. The corpus was very complex, right? And so it readapted itself to the much more complex society of the 11th century West that needed it not as, again, it was a trade union from, okay, that this was issued by the Romans, let's reuse it. No, they were actively and sort of protagonistically using it as a tool for their own law, which is very interesting. It shows you, again, how advanced the West really was to handle Roman law that way. There's a gradual discovery because at this point, the Westerners went over to Byzantine Empire to check in the local libraries where they could find the old copies of that. Because in the Byzantine Empire, they didn't work with that anymore even. That sort of law had transformed itself into something not so effective, not so developed as the same corpus, whereas the Westerners not only knew how to readapt it to their own needs, but they were the ones who already knew by frequenting the eastern coastal centers of the Mediterranean through trade, etc., what laid in those places. And so the interest of the Westerners was already fiercely advanced compared to the East at this point. Again, made plenty of other videos. Some of them I will re-upload here now, but at some point, others perhaps I already re-uploaded, but you can't listen to the audio anyway because it was mostly a picture issue, right? Brief further information: Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis was compiled between 529 and 534. Right, comprised the code, so the imperial constitutions, the digest, that is excerpts from classical jurists, the institutes, that is the textbook, and the novels that were the new laws essentially were issued also during that empire. And its recovery in northern Italy, particularly the full digest, was the most important aspect initially, was sparked the glossatorial method, as we were saying before, of textual commentary that defined Bolognese legal science. But back to our curriculum, and especially to the classes now, in the afternoon came the extraordinary lessons, regarded as less demanding in a way. The morning was seen as the more sort of the moment in which mind was fresh enough, fresher enough for sort of most foundational studies. For civil law students, these dealt with the Inforziato Digest, books 24.3 to 38, and the New Digest, the books from 39 to 50. The Vespers hours were reserved for possible repetitiones or deeper discussions. For canon law students, the afternoon sessions concentrated on the Decretals or the Liber Extra of Gregory XI. The Decretals were, as we'll see now, hence also the Decretum Gratiani, like the papal bulls fundamentally that had been issued over the centuries. And Gratian's decree, in fact, taking the name from that, compiled around 1140, represented the foundational text that harmonized these earlier ecclesiastical rulings and paralleled the revival of Roman civil law in creating a coherent body of canon law taught alongside it at Bologna. So again, interestingly enough, they were studying both canon and civil law. Obviously, you couldn't go different way really, because the episcopal authority in the city was still a thing. Even after the commune was established, there were different prerogatives that the bishop had on the countryside. Actually, the communes developed, as you know, expanded their power on behalf of episcopal authority, because that's what in the Holy Roman Empire had been properly recognized as that's we say bishops' counts, because bishops had been put since Ottonian times formally at the head of the comitatus of the city district. And so you must know canon law if you lived in the commune. If you were, as these people were, citizens of the commune, fighting in the communal army, knowing what targets to strike in the countryside, why, how, the relation with the other cities, all the other, again, the same bishops kept hiring these people, right? So for their legal matters, there was a lot of money involved in these assets. Gratian, often called the father of canon law, produced the Concordia, so the Decretum, as a systematic reconciliation of conflicting church authorities. It was later supplemented by Gregory IX's Liber Extra, 1234, compiled by Raymond of Peñafort, which became the authoritative collection of papal decretals for teaching and courts as well. Consider that we live in a world in which, yes, in theory, there are higher institutions and universal ones, as a matter of fact. And so there is, however, because of the means of the time, like a difficulty naturally standardizing these texts that were probably the ones on which the entire Europe revolved. Because, again, how do you administer ecclesiastical goods? right? Think about the entwinement. I don't know, we've seen it in the videos about Germany with the advocates, with the ministerials, but just think about the amount of people of land that depend on this kind of things. And so, as we've seen here, it's not like these texts were invented out of the blue. They were essentially the result of older traditions that were refined and presented as more foundational texts, right? When we look at here, like the mid 13th century, we're probably at the peak of European civilization and universalism during the Middle Ages. So this was the moment in which you know that the texts provided, just like the art created, just like the armies fielded, are the top, right? The most foundationally effective and scholarly reaching, right, that could be provided. A professor of civil law required 4 years to cover the entire basic program, right? It sounds almost like Schwerpunkt, as a matter of well, a professor of canon law needed 3 years, right? Which was also a way to say, basically, our civil law is more complex and important. And in many ways, of course, the church was extremely powerful and rich, etc. But civil matters were, in a broader sense, like most people lived under lay rulers. So it's also relatively explained. Also, the church tended to wage less war. This is not entirely true when you look at the papacy, in particular the papal states, but in general, right? The lay powers had some more difficult things to take care of, including capital penalties, for example, that the church could not comminate, right? And so needed these advocates in order to do so. Now, students who had regularly attended these courses could then proceed to more specialized subjects. For civil law, the institutions, that is the theoretical part of the law, and for canon law, the Liber Sextus, the decretals of Boniface VIII in particular, together with the Liber Septimus or Clementine, that is the decretals prepared by Clement V and published by his successor John the 22nd in the 14th century. Again, enormous power of these popes in particular, right? The popes of the peak of medieval civilization. In total, the complete course of studies took at least 5 years for a canon law student and 7 years for a civil law student. Anyone wishing to graduate in utroque, that is in both laws, needed at least 8 years of study, interestingly enough. And this tells you also, because it's not proportional, right? So it tells you the degree by which the civil and canon law could be combined. In this, it's very long. Like medicine lasting 7 years today, like law at the time did as well. It was by far the most important discipline. And by contrast, a student of notarial practice required only 2 years. Even though actually some of the students of law could and would end up also exercising notarial practice if they wanted. But the ultimate objective was to properly teach law itself, because at that point they were also co-opted in certain councils of the commune, say, and so they had a specific employment there, very high spheres, and so on. I made a video about the statutes and the brevia of the Italian communes, and these men were trained as doctors of law chiefly for that end, if we stick to Bologna in particular. That, as you know, at some point in the 12th century, with the Constitutio Habita, was particularly protected as an institution by the same Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. A medical student didn't study more than 4 or 5 years comparatively. Naturally, medicine was different from today, but this tells you, even just in comparison, how needed, right, in this phase of state building, of civilizational founding, legal studies. The longer timelines for civil and combined law degrees reflected the depth required also to master the vast corpus juris civilis and its glosses, preparing graduates for high-level roles in secular administration, while shorter notarial courses address the practical demand for document drafters in expanding the Italian city-states. Consider that in some places like the Nievole Valley in Tuscany, it seems like 1/3 of the local inhabitants was part of families of notaries, for telling you how traumatically literate certain parts of Europe really were. Those jobs were needed, right? That's how we're talking places like Florence. We're talking, again, the greatest financial centers out there. Imagine the regulations, right, of all the even matters in trade with the various branches all across Europe. It's enormous. It gives you an idea of why these things were happening. What is very interesting, and today we don't talk about it, is that, say, what about international law? Right? Today we talk about the UN being objected as some kind of woke institution and useless, because in any case there is nobody that is capable of simply having an international law respected. But at the time they had to make things work anyway, and so these lawyers were also heavily involved in regulating various issues between the various communes. Just to think about, you have 30 city-states in a region like the Italic kingdom, and you have two that are also heavily and efficiently entwined, right? It's not like they are truly fragmented like one another, like disconnected, like some, 300 states in Germany in an area that had much less surplus, etc. Here we're talking actually the necessity of merchants, again, to move across this territory to reach also all the various parts of Europe. So imagine how much issues would arise, especially these city-states are contemporarily fighting against one another. It's utterly insane, but they made it work. And so it's unsurprising that these were also the most advanced centers in juridical studies. The medieval lesson itself at university was called lectura, so the reading. The master would begin by reading an entire passage from the Justinianic text. He would then reread it, pausing to explain technical terms that were not immediately comprehensible, and finally read it a third time in order to examine the problem critically. This was the casus, the case, right? To set out any objections, the contrarietates, so the sort of contradictions, if you want, to review the interpretations already offered by the great masters of the past, the glosse. So these were literally the comments that were born, like in paleography. Glosse is literally the note next to the text, like in the white space, the blank space, in the layout, that were literally how eventually they were collected from the books of the great masters, put together, studied, and again, they were enormous. They were larger than the same Roman law that was being recovered. Just so imagine the depth. And say modern law is not very different if you think about it in scale. And today we have naturally also a much more complex civilization. Also, there was the suggestion of examples that could connect the theoretical causes to real contemporary facts, persons, and situations. This tripartite method of lectura reflected the scholastic approach that dominated legal pedagogy, building on the glosses accumulated by early Bolognese masters like the four doctors who succeeded Irnerius in the 12th century. The four doctors, Bulgarus, Martinus Gosia, Jacobus de Voragine, these are the Latin names, were mostly Italians, and Ugo de Porta Ravennate, were Irnerius's leading pupils who advanced the glossatorial tradition through detailed marginal commentaries that reconciled contradictions and applied Roman law to contemporary issues, influencing legal practice across Europe. This was the first generation, right? And so there is a very intense historiographical production, if anything, to an extent also debate, to exactly connect any particular glossarist tradition with which figures. Some of these are almost legendary, right? Again, not legendary because they didn't exist, right? Some there is even a debate regarding this, like the later, because there is a time you can't probably even fully document these things. But there is a later tradition of the Bologna school that said, look, our founder, or the certain figures before were these and that, and do we have any evidence for them? Was it just a way to sort of believe there had been a foundational moment, whatever? This is, again, very interesting, because we do know by sheer sort of scale of evidence that such masters would have plausibly existed. I mean, somebody that taught law at that point, while it was this morphing from the more episcopally based to more lay sort of tendent juridical teaching and research, at that point in history, it's really plausible, and we can't believe otherwise. But it's interesting how these communities later internalized the figures of these masters, right, as philosophers, as sort of almost mythical figures as far as they were concerned, right? Now, for the first 4 or 5 years, students simply sat in silence and followed the master's lesson. So imagine that. Like, imagine the distance, imagine the reverence that existed towards these teachers, right? It was like, this guy spoke. It was a big deal for you to be there. I already made some videos about medieval university students for sort of looking at the profile, who they were, and consider that most of them came even from very far away places with the fortune that their parent had given to them. And there was a risk not to make it, right? This was an incredibly privileged place to be in. What they learned could be profitably expanded. So there's a lot of adventure and heroism of these students at some point, aside from the brawls and all the issues. Were very violent times. The university guilds were quite violent themselves. But imagine, so the distance, a more traditional reading of society. This man teaching is somebody that has an enormous status, reputation, right? Some transcendental understanding. This guy is truly solving the problems of society, of politics. And as we've seen, there were sort of very open-minded people in the sort of scientific sense of the term, putting together all their notions from different fields, from a lifetime of practice. They were really astonishing for the time. Regular attendance at lectures alone was sufficient to acquire the technical body of juridical knowledge needed for high-level positions in public administration or private practice. However, those who wished to obtain academic degrees had to begin, from the 6th year onward, to engage in dialectical exercises with the master and their colleagues. These were known as principia. Once these initial tests had been passed, the student was declared a bachelor, the baccalaureus, and was required to participate in, there was sort of an initiation in the guild, right? And so in public disputationes, these were some debates, the masters organized in competition with one another during the Lenten period. Let's see who has the best student, as a matter of fact. So this tells you also what kind of quality was sought. These disputations fostered the dialectical skills central to scholasticism, training students to argue opposing positions rigorously, a method that spread from Bologna to influence theology and philosophy in universities like Paris, right? And as we've seen, again, canon law was also known, so the same tools, like the same methods, were employed. Think about rhetoric, dialectic, logic. These were taught as liberal arts in a great deal of shared curricula across different universities and studies, let's say. The term was studium, right? Aside from universitas, that was more generic. Now, when a bachelor or degree candidate felt ready for the final examinations, he would ask a professor to present him to the examination board. It's very inspiring, how to say. They had their autonomy. They had come there themselves to pay. Really, nobody obliged them. This was a permanent board. You understand also the number of years, like how long this preparation was, and so how important this overall goal really was. And this was a permanent board with a fixed number of members composed of the doctors, obviously belonging to the colleges of the civilians or the canonists. The chosen professor, also known as the promoter, first subjected the candidate to a preliminary examination, the tentamen. It has the same etymology of tempted, which the students themselves, in their statutes, insisted must be extremely rigorous, right? It was sort of sadistic, but also effective, esprit de corps, like, we want a high selection. Like a war band, somebody must be sacrificed in the strife. Like, only the best ones must pass for the sake of our own same stamp. Because again, the university was not like, I don't know, in today's world, like also public, private university. In any case, they are revered. There is all like a tutelage and so on. At the time, they had to strive for existing, for being relevant, right? So the standards were demanded from the same students. Now, if the candidate passed this test, the professor promoter informed the board, which then fixed the date of the main examination. This was just to sort of see if they were ready for the big one, and so also to spare sort of the further board from sort of inadequate candidates, which would be very useful today also, professor. Now, meanwhile, the candidate obtained all the necessary certificates, proof, for example, of having paid the regular matriculation fee to the university, of having passed all preliminary tests, of never having tried to corrupt professors or beadles, etc. On the day of the examination, the candidate went early in the morning to the sacristy of the cathedral, right? The place where the examination board met, right? So remember, there is this continuity with the local capitulary chapter. And in Bologna, according to the provisions issued in 1219 by Pope Honorius III, this board was presided over by the archdeacon of the cathedral, in fact. This also because in the meanwhile, the Pope had started extending its temporal power over Bologna at the expenses of, or at least attemptably, this will fully occur in the later 13th century, even though the Papal States never, the Pope never fully controlled Bologna up to pretty later in time, because there was all the dispute of the Romagnol and the sort of the Milian areas. Would they pertain to the Papal States from the older demands of the papacy since Carolingian times up to the Adige River, etc. in the north, or to the emperor? Right, this was an important matter. So the papacy gradually wins over the control over the Bolognese studium to protect it also from the commune, and right. And this increases also the ecclesiastical control on who could become doctor, interestingly enough. And thus, for example, this 1219 intervention by Honorius III centralized the awarding of the licentia docendi under, so the license for teaching, proper doctoral teaching under ecclesiastical authority, while preserving the collaborative role of the doctoral colleagues, marking a key moment in balancing student, professorial, and papal influence at Bologna and ensuring the universal validity of degrees. But back to our candidate. He was then assigned the various puncta, that is, the laws from the digest and the code, that he would have to discuss. After returning home, he reviewed his arguments, trying to anticipate possible questions and objections from the examiners with assistance from the professor promoter. This is also very interesting. You already know what you're going to be asked, at least because here it's not easy, right? As we've seen, the topics are many, and the amount of things to study is enormous. So at least There was a rationalization. They had understood, okay, we'll simply give him time to re-look at for fairness of certain, pages of that. But naturally, if he hasn't studied it, he can't answer, right? And remember, there had been a preliminary testing to realize whether he was sort of well schooled, well thought. In the late afternoon, the candidate returned to the cathedral, so it was just like during the same day, sacristy, and faced intense questioning from each examiner in turn, beginning with the youngest and ending with the oldest. Interestingly enough, so you see an initiatory, almost esoteric practice. When the examination ended, the candidate left the room while the examiners wrote on slips of parchment either the word approbo, that is I approve, or reprobo, that is I reject. And so this, or retest, this having to reject him in any case. This is, again, very interesting because you have also this time and wisdom, like the last guy questioning has listened to all the other questions. He holds the greater authority, at least in line of principle, by age, and he will ask therefore a question that will be not necessarily more difficult, but exactly aimed at seeing whether he had, the candidate had properly understood all the aspects through the sort of resolutive question that can dispel any doubt regarding his preparation. Now, the aforementioned slips were placed in an urn, drawn out, and read aloud. Right, so nobody really knew who had written them. Actually, the same examiners did not tell it to one another, apparently, at least in public. And if the majority read approbo, the candidate was considered to have passed and to have obtained the licencia. This is very interesting because it sort of dispelled any possibility of saying, who did actually hate me. Of course, there was a pool of examiners and you could sort of even imagine it, right? But this was also a way to express a proper judgment without risk of sort of entering personal sort of antipathy with someone or being freer also in the judgment from the other side. The candidate could, if passing, therefore call himself licentiatus in iure, right, licensed in law. To obtain the higher title of doctor, however, this was the real deal, which also entitled the holder to teach law, right? Hence our doctorate, right? Yet another public examination was naturally required. This examination was known as the conventus, and it took place in the cathedral before a very large audience. It was a really public, important event. It was incredibly interesting, and the same citizens came to see, because it was a delight to see these high minds being tested. This examination presented no particular difficulty in itself. On the contrary, it was deliberately structured to allow the candidate to make the most brilliant possible impression. However, it was ruinously expensive, involving decorations, gifts, and endless tips. It has been calculated, it was like, dubbing. In fact, also the knightly sort of equivalent of the doctorate at some point was deriving from a similar social-cultural nature of these ceremonies. It's been calculated that the entire degree ceremony cost a sum equal to what an average student would spend to live in Bologna for 4 or 5 years. Books, of course, excluded. For this reason, many students who had already become licensed chose to forego the so-called public examination and the prestigious title of doctor altogether. Others postponed obtaining the title for several years while they saved the necessary money. Right? Think about the pressure there, and again, the bitterness of this all, especially if you were not particularly affluent, but maybe you were better at the job. Still, others completed their entire course of studies up to the license at a major prestigious university such as Bologna, Padua, or Perugia. I made a video about, by the way, all 3 of these cities, other than their universities, but we talk about the latter two. But then went to graduate in a smaller university where the degree ceremonies were far less costly, right? This is very interesting. And it also shows you the degree of social connection that the doctorate entailed. I mean, it was more like a way to fully enter the this circuit of higher connections that setting up the ceremony required. All right. And so this was also, there was still an evaluation, by the way. It wasn't necessarily like this was a way to achieve still some higher perfectioning. But, right, it entailed also this great level of social recognition to begin with, because if you didn't have enough power, so to say, if you could not really convince those you had eventually to work with that you were to be one of theirs through your generosity, you couldn't quite be part of the system. This is very telling of the clientelary mechanism of the ancien regime in any case. Padua had emerged in 1222 from a migration of scholars seeking greater autonomy from Bologna, while Perugia, founded in 1308, offered more affordable options later in the period, because it was a smaller center. It was not as prestigious as Bologna or Padua. Nevertheless, it had an important university. And especially for juridical studies, again, most of the most important universities were these ones. I mean, Perugia was great. I don't know, if you came from Germany, if you came to take a doctoral degree in Italy, like these would do. There were many others. In any case, the Bolognese model was the one spreading, right? The regional variations in costs persisted, but let's say the way of learning was basically the same. Then, of course, the more important center had also the best professors in a way. Just like today, you would think that things normally work. Didn't have to be about the size of the center, but in general, right? Bologna was the most prestigious in absolute terms for different reasons. Many universities also offered one free degree per year for a poor student, interestingly enough. And so they chose which would have been the most deserving. Finally, there was one last possibility, that is to receive the degree without any examinations at all, simply through a papal bull, or more rarely an imperial diploma. Such a title carried naturally very little credit. Indeed, when people wanted to insult someone by calling him half-witted, they would refer him to as conventatus bullatus, right? So a graduate thanks to a papal bull. But this could depend on sort of different issues, like the conventatus bullatus could be also a fairly competent person. It's like, I don't know, like degree honoris causa, for example, today, right? So it's not quite the same, but could still have a value for some greater public recognition. Again, also, this was a matter of clientele. What would you get the degree with if you didn't know how to spend it, right? So it was a mix in between. The high costs and public spectacle of the conventus reflected the social prestige of the doctoral title, which conferred, as we were saying, nobility-like status in teaching rights, while the option of papal or imperial conferral highlighted the ultimate ecclesiastical and secular oversight of academic credentials in the medieval jus commune system. Right? It is the common law system that eventually, as we were hinting at before, would essentially become the same Roman law. Right? So when we look at this landscape, we made a fair amount of videos about medieval universities, right? We managed to sort of delineate an important set of dynamics that was occurring. I remember I was doing 5 years ago, or even more at this point, oh my God, how much time has passed, one of this that video about the heroic students, like the motivations of medieval university students. And I remember some of you, I don't know how much of you is still around watching me, but particularly liked it for some reason. And over time, like whenever I thought about these videos that you may think, oh my god, universities are boring, so I realized that there was still an important degree of interest here. This is the 13th video that I make about medieval universities, and I see the playlist is even relatively watched, considering, however, that it was also one of the list. It was actually a fairly old playlist. In any case, here I see, oh my god, this is such old stuff, man. You think, it makes you think, because at that time I was myself, I was already in the doctorate, or I was working for my university, I had the scholarship, etc. But let's say I was also fresh from actual studying. It didn't seem like during the doctorate it was that different from when I was at university studying. Like, it felt different, it was very different, but I don't know how many of you wants me to continue the PhD tales, because they seem like, sadly enough, I stopped those as they were relatively, like at some point people wouldn't watch them. I'm talking about some years ago now. I made, I think, only 3 or 4 episodes, and the main point about the series was, however, to illustrate how the mechanism actually functions and what it means, at least what it meant to me. But now I feel old, to have gone through that, and I don't even remember how many. Let me check. There is a playlist, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, PhD Tales 9. Wow, it's more than I thought. Yeah, reflecting on different issues. In any case, yeah. So I could actually continue that. The funny part was mostly the selection. How eventually ended up is depressing, not because I didn't succeed, but because or it wasn't, satisfying in a way, but because of what I was going through at that point. But time passes too fast. This is the greatest problem of all. Oh my god. So yeah, this is it. As far as medieval universities, we talk about the Dominicans and the Franciscans, in particular, the organization. I didn't really make so many recent videos about it, but you see here that they didn't get so few views overall. And we talk about the various, some of it is not even containing the aforementioned medieval law series. At some point I will have to re-upload lots of videos of the ones that still like, and I stopped because they made less views naturally, but they were nice videos, especially again these ones that were not, you will not find them basically anywhere else, because I was also one of the few people to study medieval law at university. But it's really an interesting discipline, and I was even taught by an actual professor of law. That's an interesting part of it, because at the faculty of law they have also history of law, and so they came to our history faculty, that very close in any case, in the same university, to teach. Like, and so you have this interesting kind of reflections, so to say, and this goes on. In any case, this was pretty much it. I hope that in any case this video was relatively enjoyable. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.